We're now going to take a look at the advantages of using terrain zones within procedural terrains, and also how we can use them from height field terrains to convert to procedural terrain, and then use those extra features that are part of it. So what I'm doing here is just adding a procedural terrain, and we're just going to do something really basic here. I did have paint on for my last option, so I'm going to delete that new layer it added. Okay, so we have our primer resolution, which is going to impact and control our painted material layer. So right now, under zones, we have an entire terrain zone. This is restricted to this resolution here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off zero edges because I may extract a zone, and in that case, if you extract an area that you define, zero edges doesn't apply. So, one thing we can do is I'm going to keep this at a low resolution just so I can show you the differences when you're painting and what you can get from the zones. I'm going to add a new material layer, manually define the presence, and let's just use, I'm not going to use a layer. Let's go ahead and find, we'll just use landscapes, and I'll use rock and grass, and discard the alpha channel. So now I'm going to turn off sculpt, and we can start to paint that in. Now this is restricted to this amount here, and this is also, with the entire terrain zone, going to be locked to the terrain and its scale. So even if we're working in world mapping mode and moving the terrain through the function, it'll still be locked to it. So let's say we want detail in just one specific area. Now we're just looking at this in the painting method here, and how we can use zones for painting, just materials at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and add a zone, and let's say we want some detail right by the camera here. Well, what I'm going to do is click and drag to create a zone. Now you can create any size you want. If you hold down shift, then you can make it square. So let's go ahead and just create that zone right there. You'll notice up at the top that instead of saying 256 by 256, it just says 256, and you'll also see that the effects tab is gone because that doesn't apply to zones. But one cool thing is we can independently adjust our resolution per zone. So now I have 1024, but that's just for this zone. So if we go back to zones and select entire terrain, we can see the whole thing is still 256 by 256. Now procedural terrain is going to continually divide, so really all that number up there matters for procedural terrain is just your painted layer, whether it's the 2D layer, well, the 2D layer or the painted material layer. But one cool thing is we can paint on these individual zones. So let's say I want to add a different material on top of that, manually define the presence. I'm just going to go over to, cancel that. And I'm going to move over into my library and grab this one here, discard the alpha channel, and now I'm going to decrease the size, and I'm going to increase the fall off so that it's harsher on the edges. So now we can paint closer details, or smaller details, in this area, and I'm just not looking for realism here or any sort of effects, just something that's going to show up to give you an idea how this works. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I had the camera over here. Now let's go ahead and zoom in, and now we can see that higher detailed or higher resolution image map controlling the alpha. I'm actually going to go ahead and do a final render, because in some cases it's actually quicker than doing the preview. Not all the time, but sometimes it just moves a little quicker, and obviously it's going to look a lot better. And now we have a higher detailed area for the painting. So we can go through zones, and there's certain areas we want to pull out, and it's especially useful if you're doing really large terrains, because you might not need to paint that much detail on it. Now, another thing that's really useful for zones is restricting your sculpted areas to a zone. Let's go ahead and add, and I'll go do this by the camera, another zone over here. Okay, so now we have the new zone, and what I want to do is switch over to sculpting. Airbrush mode, we don't want too much. Now this can mess with the flow a bit. You're going to get, most of the time when you have a smaller zone than the entire terrain zone, what happens is the pressure you would normally get for like the larger terrain is multiplied when you reduce the zone, so you have to use very small flow amounts. That's still a little too powerful, and it's at 0.038. So let's bring it down to 0.01. And then what we can do is sculpt. And I do want something that's going to be a little more obvious so we can see it. So I'm moving that inward, just cutting it in. Let's raise up this top area. And let's go ahead and just use that. And I'm going to adjust the sun, F4 on the keyboard. And there we can see that sculpted zone. And if you need to increase the resolution to get rid of any effects you don't want, or any large polygons, we can go in. Let's go back to that zone. And increase the resolution of the zone, which is also increasing not only the painted layer and the 2D layer, but also the 3D layer. And it's starting to look a little better. We might also need to kind of fade them together. So let's just take a look at this render right now and see what we're getting. And we can see that's actually turned out pretty nice. So it is blending correctly. We don't have, like what's showing up in the preview here, it's obviously a lot lower of a resolution. Sometimes you just need to render it to see how it actually looks. Now, if you reach a point, and let's go ahead, I'm just going to actually close out that graph, and let's go to our zone that we just sculpted. Now let's say we moved beyond the center and we started pulling out the sides here. I do need to reset my brush. And what if I pull up the edge beyond the zone? Let's do that. I want to see what happens here. I'll show you. What we end up with is this sharp cutoff where the zone is overlapping, or coming outside of the other part of the terrain. So one thing we can do for this is, if we go to zones, we have a fading option, which will fade the outer edges. We take a look from the top here, and we can adjust how far we want to blend it in, and then the type of blend we want to use. I'm just going to stick with a linear blend. Click OK, and that should smooth out that outer edge. And it looks like it's not quite there yet, so we might need to bring it in just a little bit more And I'm also going to go ahead and use a Gaussian. And let's just shrink it down. And it looks like it's just not quite blending in like it should. But we're still getting a lot of the inner part of the terrain, so I can probably bring it in a little more. And let's take a look at that center portion too, and it looks like that's pretty much intact. And maybe it's just not blending right now. But it should, in theory, remove that. So hopefully, in a little bit of a later release, this is still very early release of the program, maybe that'll be fixed. But otherwise, we can just go in and just make sure it's not too far off. And a brush got reset again, so I'm just going to move that down. And then we can adjust that. And we still got a little bit of a sharp line there. So right now I suggest just staying to the inner parts and not even touching the outer edges, which is usually the best way to go anyway. But normally that feature will allow you to just kind of blend it in. It looks like in this case it's not. Okay, so there's a couple other things we can do with zones. One thing we can do is extract a zone. I'm going to just turn off fading and extract it. And now it's going to ask if we want a hole, where that other one was going to be. I'm going to click yes. And it looks like what happened when I did that was the nodes weren't properly connected. So I'm going to go back into the original terrain and just, as you can see, it's all just completely flat. So we're going to go into the graph and fix that and find out why it's doing that. So it looks like we need to correct this. So normally it would set it up properly with something this simple, but it doesn't look like it's the case right now. It actually created another altitude node, so that's going to be the new one. So what we can do is connect the altitude there, and we should see that showing up, but without the zone hole. So then what we can do is we have an offset, and it just doesn't have the right input. So we can just connect the input to that, and then the output to the altitude, and that should fix the problem. There we go. So now we have a hole in the terrain. And it should match up with the extracted part. And it looks like it might be a little off. Sometimes you have to go in and blend it. Let's take a look. And it might be because it is an extracted 3D sculpted terrain that's causing the issue. So the edges actually look like they're okay. It looks like it's just a preview render that's kind of messed up. But one thing you might notice is that the layers we have for the painting are now connected to this extracted zone and matching the scale. And there's some weird shading issues too. And this isn't exactly a new problem. What I always do is before you paint or sculpt, if you plan on pulling out the zone and having it separate, do that first before you start modifying it. Usually works a little better, but otherwise just don't extract the zone. If you need to return it back to normal, I'm going to delete the zone and go back into the terrain. Let's go into the function, and what we can do is just reconnect that to the fractal and just remove the zone hole nodes completely, and that should return us back to where we were. You can also see when we're back in the entire terrain zone, we can see that zone we sculpted as a lower res to match what the original resolution is. So it's got its quirks, but for the most part, it is incredibly useful for sculpting because you can restrict your sculpting to a specific area, and you don't have to worry about dividing the entire terrain in places where it doesn't need to go. Now, this is really useful, but what if you're working with a height field terrain? Well, let's take a look at what we can do. We can still use zones, but we have to essentially bake the height field, which it will do automatically. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new terrain. And now normally when we convert, we can just copy the function and paste it into a procedural. If we're going to just transfer over the 2D layer. But I'm going to show you how you can take your existing terrain using the new erosion nodes, which are definitely very cool, and I'd like to be able to use the zones with that. So what I'm going to do is go to the erosion node, select the generic, and just connect it to that. Go to height field, and we're going to auto map it so that it's -1 to 1 on the altitude. Connect that to here, and then we'll see this erode. There we go. Now, actually, I'm just going to increase the resolution just a little bit more. Now, whatever resolution you have set here is going to be essentially the new fixed resolution for the terrain. Once you perform this action, convert it to a procedural terrain, you will not be able to modify it any further. If you want to be able to go back, I highly suggest that you just take the terrain, and I'm actually going to go ahead and delete that new material it added. Click OK. So what I suggest you do is take the terrain, and you can copy it and paste it in order to have a backup copy. You can fall back to if you want to modify that and then go back. But if you're working with new zones and you're painting, then that's not going to work super well. It's not going to match up, but it does allow you to take the big image that's going to come out of this and transfer it over. So what we could also do is just add a layer, move that terrain into that layer, and we can hide it from the scene and make sure it's not rendering. Or you can just export that terrain, load it in later if you want to make modifications. Now let's go back in, and it's really easy now. What we used to have to do is export the terrain and load it in as a texture map, which is covered in another part of the training. But what we can do is, once we have this set up, and View knows that it can't just transfer this over with the height field node, so it does bake it automatically. So let's go up to the top here and convert it from a height field to a procedural. And what it's going to do is go ahead and bake it and set up that texture map that's linked to it directly. So then what we could go in and do is then add our zones to the terrain and then set up our independent scales for painting on it. Now when you divide it like this, it's going to use that image, and you're going to notice some pixelation, but it does allow you to still increase the painted image on there. Another thing I want to do is go to edit the function, go to the texture map, and make sure it is on bicubic, so that way we don't get huge pixels. But that's another way we can go in here and paint on a specific area to that zone. Discard the alpha, and I'm just going to paint on this one. And that's based on this resolution here, where the entire terrain is back to the 512 by 512, which is where it was before. So we can click OK, and we should be able to see that painted area on this height field terrain now. And we can see that showing up right here. So that's part of that zone. Do a quick render. And we also don't have to worry about the height field processing, since it is baked. But now we can go in and use the zone tools on a height field terrain. And you could load in other images to control that as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be directly converted over from a procedural or from a height field into a procedural. You can use exported images from previous terrains and load them in at any time if you want to modify and paint in more specific areas. Also, if you want to work with a 3D layer, you can go in here, select your zone, and then if you want to sculpt, go into paint, you can select your sculpt method, And I'm going to turn down that flow because we don't want it coming out too much. And then we can modify and paint the 3D areas in that specific area. And it looks like it did something here to the way that's being processed. So maybe in this case the 3D won't work so well on here, because it has removed the 2D layer completely, which it shouldn't have. And it's possibly a scale change. It's just set to a texture map. Let's go ahead and actually see if I can convert this over to a projected texture map, but it'll probably move that. There we go. So you just need to go in and make sure instead of using a regular texture map, you can change it over to a projected texture map, and thankfully it does preserve that image within it. So we don't have a problem doing 3D sculpting on there. One thing you'll notice is possibly these polygons or these blocks, and that looks like because the interpolation type might not be set. Interpolation by cubic, and then we should see some smoothing in here, because otherwise you just get the straight pixels. So that actually does convert over quite well. And we can set up sculpted zones, and then based on height field terrains, which means we can use the new erosion nodes very easily with this. Another thing we want to make sure we do is once again, well, if you haven't seen the other part of the training yet, what can happen is you get this big seam because it is repeating itself. So what it's doing is taking the elevation from this side, and we get about 1 pixel's worth of geometry being extruded. So since I changed that texture map to a projected texture map in order to make it work properly, one thing we need to do, which was set on the original image, is set this from repeat to mirror, and that way the sides and the edges that go off to the sides will match the current edges, which is right here. So that is now corrected and fixed. So some really cool stuff you can do with zones and terrains, and it's really useful for painting and sculpting and defining specific areas, and it's definitely the preferred way to work, at least for me. I find that I can, when I want to sculpt an area, instead of just sculpting the whole terrain, you just go in, sculpt a zone, paint zones if you want detail. Great stuff you can work with for modifying terrains.